Hey everyone, welcome back to the Questioning Behavior podcast. As always, I'm Merle and I'm here with my much better half, Sarah.
Hi guys.
You're the dummy that don't believe in science. All your projects always be denying. You're the dummy that don't
And today, this is not a original topic. Well, not only has it been probably done to death by other much more experienced podcasters, but we have done it once before as well, as we've talked to people in marketing quite a bit. Of course, you hopefully still remember our epic episode with Rory Sutherland, which we thoroughly enjoyed. I've listened to it back lately. I still just... You can tell that Rory knows a lot, but you can also tell he likes to talk a lot, which, I mean, I'm here to listen to it. I'm perfectly happy. But today we're talking to yet another marketeer who is very, very good at this craft. And then my question to Sarah becomes, how much do you know about the application of behavioral science in marketing?
It's a good question because the fields quite naturally, I think, overlap, right? In terms of, what you're trying to do is essentially, in marketing or branding or advertising, is to get people to change their behavior, right? In terms of, making the right choice at the point of consumption, like choosing your brand over someone else's. So that should be a lot of overlap. We didn't, throughout my sort of education and, the way that I've sort of collected knowledge about behavioral science, I like examples from the advertising, marketing, branding world were just not something that were used, in a sort of a behavioral economics perspective to sort of say, look, this is a good example of behavioral economics in action or behavioral science in action. So it has always been a bit of a black box for me, which is why it's so exciting to actually get to speak to people who, practice this craft and can teach me a lot and fill in a bit of the holes as to what goes into it. I mean, what about yourself? Like, what sort of knowledge are you coming in with to this episode about behavioral science and marketing?
Everything that Rory has told me.
Okay.
Otherwise, very little. No, I'm the same as you, like all the examples that we've seen. So marketing to me is very much about behavioral change, because you want someone to buy something or to have a different opinion on a product or service or the company as a whole. But behavioral change examples, the way I've been taught them, never come from the marketing side. It's very much, to get people to pee into the urinal, not next to the urinal, stuff like that type of behavioral change, or to actually exercise, or to actually save. But yeah, it's not really something that I know a lot about from a marketing perspective. So I feel like we're better off just getting Steve on the call and hear what he has to say and how he applies behavioral science to marketing, and whether we can get yet another nice behavioral change model out of that. So yeah, let's dive in. So today we're here with Steve. So Steve, as always on this podcast, please tell the audience, who are you, what do you do, and how did you get there?
Hi, my name's Steve Brunt. I'm the planning director at an agency, a creative agency called the Behavioural Agency. And we're basically exist to make marketing more effective by using behavioural science. And my role in that is to do the strategic parts, so help find the behavioural science that can influence the creative, whether that's brand or user journeys or any other part of the creative process.
And how did you get there?
How did I get there? That's a long story because I'm old. So I started... I started off in the not-for-profit sector. So I started on behaviour change before marketing. And I really was I ended up in marketing by looking for ways to change behaviour and looking to marketing for that. I started in the not-for-profit sector and then the government side of the business, and then eventually got bored of waiting for things to happen there and moved into retail marketing, then digital, and now I've finally found my true home in an agency that puts behavioural science at the heart of what we do.
Okay. So behavioural stuff first, then a bit of marketing, and then back to the behavioural stuff. Fair
Well, it
enough.
was all behavioural. So actually, I think that my perspective on it has always been, if you're not changing behaviour with marketing, then what are you doing? All marketing is designed to change behaviour or affect behaviour. And if it isn't doing it, then it's probably not doing very much. It's probably a waste of time. And actually, my early sort of view of marketing when I first sort of came across it, as that first job in not-for-profit sector, was that it seemed to be talking a lot about things like awareness. And I couldn't see the point of that. I thought, well, that doesn't seem to be changing what people do. That doesn't seem to be influencing what people do. So I looked for the ways that you could actually change what people do and what actually shapes behaviour. And obviously, once you start down that journey, you end up in behavioural science fairly quickly, and you start finding the evidence of what really does affect people's behaviour. And then you start saying, well, why aren't we using this? Like, why don't we do more of this? And actually, strangely enough, I think the whole world of marketing has been aware of that for really at least a decade, maybe longer. But the problem is, it's always been, I think, behavioural science has always been interesting but not useful. It's always been the way it's explained to people. It's all very anecdotal. It's all very, the Economist did this once, or this experiment once proved this, but not something that becomes a sort of generalizable principle that you can then take into your own work. So people are very interested in the anecdotes. I know you've had Rory on here. Rory, who can tell anecdotes till the cows come home. But actually turning that into something that's a meaningful tool for marketing is a much bigger challenge. And so that's really why I think it's taken a long time for marketing to get to the point where it's ready to do that. And certainly from our point of view, we're the only agency I'm aware of that's actually kind of codified the science and built it into a system that works with what marketing is designed to deliver, like creative work and brands and user journeys and that kind of stuff. So for me, it's been a long journey to get there through a lot of different aspects of marketing, from digital to retail journeys to not-for-profit to social marketing. All of that stuff has played a part in shaping my view of marketing, but it's also played a part in shaping my approach to how we take behavioural science into the discipline of marketing.
Yeah.
All right.
Fascinating.
So,
Absolutely fascinating.
yeah, sounds great.
So, I mean, how much of what behavioral science brings to the field of marketing, how much of that is like really like new stuff that the field has sort of not, been thinking of before? Or how much of is it just changing the way you view the problem or view the route to the solution, do you think?
That's a really good question. I think there's a whole load of what the discipline of marketing has done for literally centuries, really, that is demonstrates the principles of behavioural marketing, behavioural science, but not because of that. It wasn't designed to do that. So every salesperson knows how to use immediacy and the power of free, and they know how to play with the notion of loss aversion, and there's lots of different techniques that are used in every kind of marketing, and salience and all sorts of aspects of design are rooted in behavioural science. They're just not explained that way. They're sort of intuitive, and the reason for that is because they just make sense and because they work. But they don't always work because they don't always it's not always the case that people are short of time or feel pressured to make a decision quickly, or are not willing to invest thought in the process. So actually sometimes behavioural science techniques, nudges and biases and stuff like that aren't appropriate. And there's a whole sort of system behind that now for me that will explain that process and when to use what. Which is something that I think has been lacking. But yeah, I think in principle, you're right. Behavioural science has been there, sort of lurking in the background of the most effective marketing, from jingles to, Sillet Bang. I don't know if you remember Sillet Bang. Like, there's loads of really great principles at play, but no one was doing it because they had the behavioural science behind them. They're doing it because it's just good marketing. Then I think there was another aspect to your question, which I've now forgotten.
I think that was pretty good. It's just changing the way, it's like recodification, maybe, of...
there is something new, though. I think you said, is there anything that's new? And I think that what is different is, For generations, really, marketing has been obsessed with this idea of the unique selling proposition, of finding the thing that makes you different and talking extensively about that, having this one message that you just replicate across everything you do. And again, if you actually start looking for the science behind that, what's the evidence that, like, apart from obviously repetition is a good thing, it's useful for embedding things in people's minds, does it change behavior? Does it make people do things differently if you tell them the same thing over and over again? Or actually, should you be focusing in a different place? And so every creative brief I've ever written anywhere else has had a box with proposition on it, and you're supposed to fill this box in and explain what the one single thing that this campaign needs to get across is. And I've pushed that back and said, that doesn't make sense. We start with the behavior, not with what the client wants to say. So what's the default behavior? What would people do if we did nothing? What's the desired behavior? What do we want them to do as a result of interacting with this communication? And that way, you start to see the gap between what people would do anyway, which is the real competition, and what you want them to do. And then you start being able to judge what the most appropriate kind of marketing intervention is to deliver that change. Because if you don't do that, you're not thinking about the default behavior. You're not thinking about what will happen. What the real competition is inertia. It's to keep doing what they would have been doing anyway. To keep barreling along, following the same habits, doing the same routine, jumping back to the same pattern that they've done before. That's what people do in real life. They don't judge two messages next to each other and go, now I'm going to choose Coke. That's not how the brain works. So the big difference for me is to turn marketing around and say, actually, it's about the behavior change. It's not about the message. And that is a huge sort of challenge to the industry, actually, to say, oh, why have we doing this? Because it doesn't actually make sense. I mean, it works sometimes, but it doesn't make sense and it doesn't have any scientific basis. So what we're doing instead is saying, actually, if you take the scientific basis of behavior, and then you say, if we start with that default behavior and we try and get to the desired behavior, how big a leap that is depends very much on the kind of thing you need to achieve. So if all you're looking to do is to get somebody to click a button that they wouldn't otherwise click, then obviously you can use all sorts of nudges and biases to do that. You can write the right thing on it and you can make it the right color and you can make it the right place on the screen for them and all that sort of stuff. If you're trying to get them to buy an electric car instead of a diesel car, then you're going to have to press some different buttons and you can't rely on biases and nudges to get that across, because people are going to think hard about that and they are very ingrained in the behavior that they're following. And so getting a whole change of a leap of behavior like that is going to require a deeper investment in changing their motivations and changing what's driving their behavior in a bigger sense. So then you have to get into more of the sort of cognitive side of things and what actually is the psychology of motivation and how can we delve into that and get to the real motivations behind why people do the actions they do.
Yeah, definitely. Like this whole idea of start at the end is something that we've heard from other people we've interviewed, and it just it's an amazing way to reframe the problem. And I wonder whether or not the focus on USP or unique selling point is almost like the same thing as the focus on awareness that you were talking about before, of just like, if we just make people aware of why our product is different, then that'll be enough. Is there a parallel there, you think? Yeah.
There is. There's this sort of strange obsession. I think it's a very it's almost a solipsism that has caught brand marketers in particular, where they think if they just talk about themselves enough, then the customer will inevitably hear what they want them to hear. But in reality, it makes a lot more sense to start at the customer end rather than at the brand end and figure out what it is you're trying to make resonate. Because I use this example a lot. Like the brain is not an information processing machine. That's not what it's good at. It's a comparison machine. It's really good at comparing things. So it compares with past experience. It compares with two things next to each other, and it can pick difference out of a sea of sameness and familiarity out of a world of chaos. It can pick the brain, and your brain is incredibly good at comparison. It's not very good at processing huge amounts of data. And so marketing's always approached it as if the goal is to try and cram as much information in as possible, rather than the goal being to trigger the right part of the brain at the right time. And actually, really good marketing, really effective marketing, doesn't communicate in the sense of getting information across. It communicates in the sense of creating resonance, creating unity, creating commonality. So you think about the difference between the Remain campaign and the Leave campaign, for instance. everybody remembers exactly what the Leave campaign said at the very top. Like everybody can remember Take Back Control. Everybody can remember that.
I just remember this massive number of millions and billions that they were going to save if they left the EU and they could pump back into the NHS, which I don't think is happening.
And I don't want to I'm not reopening that whole kind of words by any means, but what I will say is we can remember that. We can remember the figureheads. We can remember the colour. We can remember the slogan. And there was absolutely no factual basis behind any of it. There was no information to support that at all. All of that comes down to good, effective communication. It created a resonance. It created a sense of of what unifies this group of people to take that one action. They only needed to go and tick a box one day. That was all they needed to do. So they didn't need to get 99 reasons to stay in the EU and try and communicate all of them at different times. So one campaign created resonance and the other campaign created information. And you can see which one won out in that context. And there is a whole load of great brand assets there as well that have lasted. But there's also just good comms principles about what are you trying to do? You're trying to create resonance. The most effective communication creates that resonance with people where they feel it sort of resonating with something inside them. And if you tap into the right motivations, in that case, control, but it could have been belonging, it could have been security, it could have been status, it could have been pride, it could have been pleasure. There's lots of different motivations that drive people's behavior. That one is very powerful because it's quite, not that it's right down there in the kind of hierarchy of needs. Security, a sense of control, a sense of being able to, take back control. So it's quite an important part of us that's tapped into there, which doesn't work in all senses by any means. You can't do that to sell toothpaste, really.
You could try.
A sense of belonging with. Yeah, I wonder, a sense of belonging with Colgate.
You can try them all. And that's the great thing about sort of taking that approach of saying, okay, what are the foundational principles at play here? Because actually we use this thing called the y-axis, which basically does map motivations on a scale from fear to hope and self to others. Because fundamentally, actually, that lets you arrange all of the kind of motivations that could exist into a nice, neat framework that you can actually use quadrants for, and you can sort of show people. And the reason why that works is because actually every behaviour has a motivation behind it, and at the very most incremental level, that's emotions. That's sort of the little trigger response, stimulus response of hope, fear, towards, away from. So that kind of very micro motivation of an emotion is a really good demonstration of it at play in something very simple. But actually, when you dig deeper, actually we are all driven by trying to keep what we've got or hoping for more. And so like there's that fear to hope scale works really well. But also we look at the world through how it compares to our own ideals, our own needs, versus how we compare ourselves to others. And so this sort of framework of the y-axis works as a way of organising that principle, and then we can break it down into all the smaller parts of that, like the difference between status and power and pride and pleasure and self-expression and all the other parts of that sort of picture. But they all basically fit onto that framework quite neatly, which is much better if I've got a visual version of it to show you, but at least that doesn't really work. Yeah.
Sorry.
No, you did a great job of describing that. I've got a great visual picture, but maybe it's just because I'm used to looking at y-axes a bit too often.
It's entirely possible.
Yeah. No, I think it's interesting. There's this like emotion-based or feeling-based model of behavior and motivation, particularly as you're trying to create resonance, which kind of sounds like something that's very, very difficult to do, very tricky to do. You can't observe resonance. You can't observe. Well, can you observe resonance? How do you go about trying to do something that sounds impossible?
Well, that's a very good point. So you have to try and understand. You have to dig deep. Most market research asks people questions, as you know, that are riddled with research fallacies, like asking people, which brand comes to mind. Well, the brand that comes to mind in a research environment is very different to the brand that comes to mind when you're actually shopping for it. And in the same sort of way, you've got to ask the right questions to get to what are the motivations behind your purchase decisions. And the big challenge there always is motivations. So I'll just go back slightly and just say we break behaviours down into three parts. Every behaviour has to have a motivation, a means, and a trigger. You can call it different things, different models call it different things, but fundamentally, there has to be a motivation. You have to want to do it. You have to have the means to do it, the resources, and there has to be some trigger that means that you're going to do it now. And those all have to be present.
That sounds very much like Combi.
Yeah, it is very similar. It's just slightly different because the way we break that down is to say, actually, motivation. So because we're thinking very much about commercial application of this, we're thinking about shopper journeys and things that are driving sort of marketing in a broader sense. That's where we're that's where our world is really. Motivations are before the trigger. They're most important before the trigger, and they kind of get set before you're triggered into market. Again, if you can imagine a diagram here of a sine wave going up and down across a line that is the line between being a consumer and being a buyer, being a shopper. Sure. Before you say, for instance, if you're buying a car, before you're actively in market, you spend a whole lot of time sort of wandering around, noticing cars in car parks and thinking, oh, I like the shape of that, I like the colour of that, I wonder if that one would, and you start sort of absorbing all this information, but you're not actively shopping. And then at some point, something changes and you cross that line and you're actively shopping. Now, once you've crossed that line, effectively your motivations are pretty much set. So the trigger has changed you from being motivation-driven to being means-driven. Now you're starting to judge the market. You're starting to appraise the options within that market. And so if you've decided that what you're looking for is a hybrid family car, and you've sort of got this kind of picture in your mind, you start just making the judgments about that stuff. So the time to target motivations is when people are in consumer mode, not in buyer mode. Then in buyer mode, you're actually much more interested in making sure they're judging you on the right criteria. So you're hoping that you've launched them into market with the right kind of motivations for you to come out on top, but also that you're expressing yourself in ways that allow them to see you as better than the competition. Because as I say, we're comparison engines. So we're always making a comparison. We always need to know that we're not just there is no objective judgment of what's a good car. You have to be a better this than that, a better family car than that. So there's a famous ad for Golf, which was all about like a Golf, but, and Golf was always saying, well, why don't you just get a Golf? And that's the point, really, is everybody has a kind of benchmark in mind. So you want to be that benchmark so that people are always falling short. Sure. Anyway, point is, targeting motivations is about getting into that consumer mindset. When you're not making judgments about how much it costs or exactly what the download speeds are going to be or blah, 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 those things aren't. You're buying into a brand idea. You're buying into a motivation. So that's why brands need to tap into the mindset of their customers out of market, not in market.
Okay.
And that's a big challenge for people because obviously what they really want to do, they want to know, well, what do people buy on? What are people most concerned? Actually, what they buy on isn't what drives them into market and isn't what makes them choose, isn't what makes you top of mind when they enter the market. So in a way, you've got to sort of suspend the idea of what they judge what the sort of parameters or metrics of the market are and worry first about what actually are people worried about or excited about or motivated by to enter the market in the first place. And then you get a very different perspective on what they'll be thinking of when they enter the market. So you have to research that differently. You have to actually dig into what really drives people and what drives what you think resonates about your brand with an audience that you're trying to reach.
So then I'm quite curious. So what brands would you say have almost perfected this getting to you before you've even considered buying?
John Lewis did it well originally with the, I think I say originally, at some point they did it with the Always a Woman to You ad. I don't know if you know that ad. You're
I remember that.
Wasn't in the UK then.
It's a brilliant ad that is just pure emotion. It shows someone on a journey through life effectively, and John Lewis products just sort of effortlessly swim around them in this beautiful middle class life with a lovely song behind it. and it's not pushing anything in particular. It's just showing how John Lewis will mold around your life, and it'll always be perfect for you. And it's it's a really good ad. Look it up on YouTube. It's great. But that wasn't selling anything in particular, and it wasn't talking to anyone in particular. Really, it was just lodging an idea, just building an idea about where John Lewis fits into your world. So to me, that's a really great example. Apparently. I think the counter to that is then what they do with what they do with Christmas, because then they absolutely are trying to think about how people shop. And so they've taken a bit of that magic and sort of ruined it a little bit by going Christmassy with it. But fundamentally, they do actually, because you launch those Christmas ads in November, and they're spread around as almost part of the Christmas experience. They do keep some of that magic, and they are more about kind of almost, the John Lewis ad this year is a phenomenon. So.
Okay, so John Lewis is a brand that has managed to keep it really, really general throughout most of the year, and then super specific at the end of the year, and it seems to work quite well. John Lewis is not really. I don't know. When I think about brands who really just inspire a certain image, like I was thinking more of like brands like Apple, because John Lewis. Maybe I'm just not in the right target group for John Lewis, although I do eat food, which I think is what they predominantly sell. I don't actually know. Yeah, maybe it's just because I'm not British.
That's what it is. Not
but
British
to me,
enough.
it's like, I thought when it comes to like these absolute marketing titans, like people who've really understood, for better or for worse, what's going on. Yeah, I think of things like Apple. Or are you not a massive fan of what Apple does, or do you think they do it too well? Maybe.
Well, I just think, I was already skirting very close to cliche by using the John Lewis example, so reverting to Apple would be pretty dreadful, really. I think, of course, Apple have done a fantastic job of building a whole kind of world of brand that means that people are buying into an entire ecosystem of user experience and lots of different aspects, all of which feel clean and crisp and uniquely Apple, and probably we're all sitting here on Apple computers. I certainly am. And there's a whole system there that works really well as a brand. And yeah, absolutely, they completely understand that people don't really buy computers on the performance. They don't buy Apple computers on the performance. What they're really buying it on is the fact it's got a lovely picture of an apple on and it's a nice silver. And then they're justifying it with all of the supposed performance advantages and user experience elements to it. And actually what people do is ignore all the frustrations of those things and focus on the love they feel for the brand and then rationalize behind it. But it's the emotion that drives it in the first place, and the rational just comes behind it. And not so much for other computers. There are other computers out there that people do buy on performance measures. They just don't buy that. You just wouldn't pay what you pay for an Apple computer and dedicate your life to it in the way that people dedicate their life to the Apple ecosystem without having a fundamentally different driver behind that. And that's what that's what is a really good example of why motivation is important and why emotions are important, because actually that's where all the value lies. That's how you can charge £300 more for the computer. And that's what people are paying for when they're when in the intangibles of brand. So yeah, it's really powerful from that point of view.
Yeah, and I'm still fascinated by this use of emotion, or understanding motivation through the sort of an emotional lens. I mean, if you were to be consulting on a marketing campaign, is it about building an emotional resonance with the brand and not the product? Is that the goal?
Mostly, yeah. I mean, it depends very much on what you do. Like in essence, if you're trying to do brand marketing, then that's what you're doing. If you're trying to do product marketing, you might be in a different space. And if your brand is really your product, or your service, which is quite often the case, then you can't really make the distinction. Increasingly, brands like Uber or Deliveroo, for instance, that the brand is the service, the brand is the promise of delivery.
Yeah.
So you can't make much of a distinction, and actually what you're really trying to do there is create trust in the experience. So your brand is built on actual in the moment delivery.
Okay.
And they're a really interesting example actually of how the world of brand has moved on, because they've both been quite flexible about the assets of the brand and the changing of the logo and stuff like that, because actually their trust exists in the moment. Nobody trusts Uber in the bigger sense. Nobody believes Uber are a trustworthy operation.
Yeah.
They absolutely trust Uber with 5 minutes to go. They trust Uber because they can see that it's there on the screen around 5 minutes around the corner. And same with delivery. Nobody trusts them. They all know that they're kind of doing stuff to their staff that isn't particularly not staff. Sorry, whatever they're called. Their special terminology that excludes them from being staff. But the fundamentals of it are that trust isn't deep and resonant. It's very transitory. It's about the experience trust. It's not about the deeper trust. Whereas things like banks, nobody trusts a bank in the moment, but they absolutely trust the heritage of it. So you can't be absolutely certain. Like, there's very different kinds of trust in the world, and increasingly, because we're in an immediacy space, we're in a very kind of want it now, on demand kind of world. We can get by on that in the moment trust in a way that we didn't used to be able to. You would never have felt comfortable getting into a complete stranger's car just because some app told you it was coming. 10 years ago.
Fair enough. So I'm quite curious, because Uber, amongst many other companies, is quite problematic about how it handles its people that aren't technically speaking employees and that are just currently being really, really badly exploited, and the many legal and economic and structural inequality issues surrounding that. How would you go? Because Uber is still, it is very convenient, it is very, very widely used, but how would you go about flipping the entire script on Uber, knowing that the bigger company is rampant with issues, and that we don't actually trust the bigger company, but we do trust the car that's 3 minutes away on our screen? How would you go from a marketing perspective absolutely ruining such a company? just curious.
Don't sue us, Uber. Thank you.
So how would I anti-market Uber or Deliveroo?
Yeah.
Well, so this comes back to this point about like how biases work. So the reason why those companies are so successful is because they're playing into all of our natural biases of immediacy and seeing something as very slightly cheaper. If we're making a judgment in a moment without much thought, which we do all the time, then and that momentary reward is there. Then in the moment it's going to win every time. And if it's built on consistency of those moments, then it becomes a habit. So you've got a really easy habit building system there, which is what all these companies are built to do. Get in the habit of using Deliveroo. At some point, maybe they'll become profitable. At some point, they might actually start turning up. Deliveroo still lost hundreds of millions of pounds through this pandemic because it cost them money to deliver everything.
I have been wondering about that. Their business model is essentially to become market dominant, right? And then hopefully eventually make some money.
I think it might be a little bit more like a pyramid scheme. Like in theory, it's like that, but in practice, it's probably more like the original investors get to sell out to the shareholders who buy in the IPO because it looks shiny and new, and then those shareholders lose the money when the thing tanks gradually over time. I'm not sure there is a way in which a business like that can actually become profitable, because they're not driving anybody else out of business. And so actually what they're doing is probably more like a bait and switch of getting people to invest in the company rather than actually ever turning a profit for those people. Might be the same with Uber. In the old days, companies used to have some money. Now you just make up the money. People make it up, and then you invest all this made-up money in a company, and then it comes back. But if we ignore the fact that the actual economics of the business make no sense, because no one's going to be interested in that, then...
Well, I mean, I am.
Do you use it? But do you use Uber or Deliveroo?
Barely. If I have no option. So not so interested as to not use it, and same with Amazon, and same with any other company that people might have some sort of doubts about the ethics of using, but God, it's convenient.
And so at the end of the day, convenience in the moment always wins. So if you want to break that, then you have to consciously break with those convenient moments and make people make a choice in advance. Again, it comes back to it, when you're live in market and you need a cab or you need some food delivering. That's not the time to attack Deliveroo or Uber. That's not the time to try and beat them. You can't be slightly better than them and win, because they're much more dominant in the mind. They're already there straight away, top of mind. You have to win when you're not. So you have to market things to people who aren't in need of food delivery or being picked up. And you have to target those motivations and go into the heart of how can we make your ethical values translate into making a different choice when the next occasion arises? How can we make you think, actually, I want to go and walk to the store and pick up rather than have it delivered, because it's good for me and it's good for the store and it's good for smashing that Deliveroo business. How can we favour a local firm, favour phoning up and talking to a human to get a taxi booked for us, rather than just using an app? How can we make people see the value of that? So you tap into, actually, right now, because of the pandemic, everybody's re-embraced neighbourhood and sense of local and the value of having things close to home. And so you play on some of that and you say, actually, let's play on that to make it not Deliveroo, but to make it a face-to-face experience and an appreciation of local and a chance to get a breath of fresh air, and a chance to meet a local business person who runs a taxi firm or speak to them on the phone, revalue like face-to-face or voice-to-voice contact with people while they're out of market. Out of market. And then when they're in market, maybe that'll be the thing that comes to mind, rather than how easy it is to get it delivered. Because in the moment, delivery will still come up. But if when you get there and you make that decision, what you're deciding is, do I want Deliveroo or do I want a more human experience? Do I want Uber or do I want a more human experience? Then maybe you'll press a different button on your phone, because actually you're judging against a different criteria now. Your criterion has shifted to the motivation that we've tried to establish earlier on, to being, actually, I want a human experience of my local food providers, rather than I just want local food now. And that's possible. And then if you're really taking it on, then you'd start targeting some of the areas. We use another little framework. We call it metric, and that's because it's an acronym for money, effort, time, risk, individuality, and conscious thought. These are the means that we have at our disposal at all times. These are the resources that we can spend, and we can spend them interchangeably. So if you haven't got a lot of time, you'll spend a bit more money. If you haven't got a lot of money, you might take a bit of a risk. And if you don't want to take a risk, you'll follow the crowd and not spend any individuality. So, we've all been in that situation where you've got two food vans, one's got a queue and one hasn't, and you just think, I'm not going to the one with no queue. Why? What do all these people know that I don't? So you end up joining the queue, and you'd rather spend the time and be with the herd than take a risk and go somewhere that nobody else is voting for. So you can spend these resources of money, effort, time, risk, individuality, and conscious thought interchangeably. But also, these are the 6 categories that we all make very quick, very instant judgments on, because we use them all the time. So these are the categories of bias, the categories of nudge at our disposal. So when you think about what Uber does, it plays to that idea of saving time, saving effort, even saving money, but less of that now. When it first started, it was all about that. And those are all on the kind of the practical side of that. And then you've got risk, individuality, and conscious thought. So if we actively want people to think about the choice they're making, then we play to that. We play to conscious thought. We'd actually create friction in that experience rather than letting them go with the flow of not really thinking about it and following the autopilot. We try and create friction in that moment to make them not just choose what they would have done. We might consciously make them feel like an individual rather than somebody who's willing to go with the flow, go with the herd, and just keep using Uber even though it questions against their own values. Or we might choose to kind of actively highlight risk, even like what are the consequences of that stuff. Or very consciously kind of say, what am I missing out on by not doing this? Like, what do I lose by using Deliveroo instead of walking to and picking it up myself? So these 6 resources of money, effort, time, risk, individuality, conscious thought are really useful for they are the metrics by which we measure markets as well, in the simplest sense, because they're the things that we all understand intuitively and the things that we make judgments about every single moment of the day. We're all sitting here thinking another 14 minutes of this podcast potentially. So like, time is a resource.
Bit harsh.
No, I mean,
harsh. I was hoping you were actually getting a benefit.
I know Sarah's got another meeting coming out. So.
That's very conscientious.
Yeah.
So they're the resources we all have at all times, but they're also the things that we make snap judgments on. So they are the things that drive. We can categorize just about any of the biases in the world, any of the behavioral science biases, into one of those 6, because they're all about that moment of relativity, that moment of comparison between a number that that's been put in your head that's anchored, and the number that's now in front of you, or the immediacy of the thing in front of you, or some long distant future thing, the recency immediacy thing in time. All of these things that fit into this pattern of money, effort, time, risk, individuality, and conscious thought, which is what makes it such a powerful framework, because it's actually a way of generating ideas and solutions for problems. So that's another thing that we do with it, is to say, okay, so suppose you've got a problem with one of your emails, so refer a friend email, for instance. Yeah. Why aren't people taking up the offer? We can say, well, maybe you're pitching the financial reward wrong. Maybe the money's not coming across in the right way. Maybe you're pitching it as, a voucher to spend instead of money off your bill. And people would rather have money off for something functional like a bill, rather than more money to spend when they've just spent money on a bill. So maybe the money's wrong. Maybe it feels like too much effort. Maybe it's too complicated to get your head around. Maybe there's no urgency to it. Why act on this email right now? Maybe we need to inject more immediacy into it. Maybe they don't know what's coming. There's uncertainty. There's risk. They don't know what will happen if they click that button, so they don't click it. Maybe the journey isn't sort of clear enough. The next step isn't clear enough. Maybe people don't feel like recommending a utility company because they wonder how their friend will take it if they refer them to a utility company. So maybe there's a kind of herd mentality there that we need to tackle, and we have to give people a sense of. And maybe we need to take the step out of it and almost try and make it an autopilot thing, or make it make more use of the environment to create the sense of conscious thought being a premium, and use it differently. So we can take any problem that a client comes to us with and very quickly generate 6 solutions just off the back of that. And then that's the ones that sort of go with the flow and try and use the flow of that. You can then use the friction side of it and say, well, what if we try and draw more attention to the money? Or we try and draw more attention to the effort? We try and show the effort that's gone into this to get the effort heuristic at play. And so actually you can sort of go around the circle again and come up with 6 more solutions straight away. So for things like communications,
choice overload.
Well, actually, the point really is then you've got some decisions to make.
Yeah.
Once you get to that point, you've actually can just go, well, which ones of these should we test? Which ones should we try? Which ones most naturally play into to this environment? Because obviously, most of the time, not all of those factors are at a premium, and because these things are interchangeable, if we wanted to focus more on time, it would be at the expense of the other things. You can't make everything salient, so you're going to have to make some choices. But you're making choices conscious of the fact that actually they fit a framework of value relativity. Because behavioural science at the end of the day is the science of value relativity. It's about understanding that relativity is what drives us. There are no objective judgments. We always have to have a point of comparison, and what matters is what is the frame of reference against which you're being judged. And if you can influence that frame of reference, take control of that frame of reference, you've got a much greater chance of winning in marketing. If you've shaped the perception of the market, you've shaped the reason why people enter the market, or you've framed the choices, or you've primed the environment with the right smells and all that sort of stuff. All of these fundamentally come down to frames of reference. Like, what is the thing that people are going to fall back to? Because our brains are fundamentally really flawed when it comes to making these kind of judgments. And the ways they're flawed is that when we get a set of stimulus in front of us, our brains look for a match. They look for a pattern match. That's what they do. It's how the brain works. Is it takes the stimulus that's getting thrown at it, filters out the stuff that isn't changing, finds something that's changing, and then looks for a pattern to explain it and to judge what the next action should be. And it's not the best pattern match that the brain finds. It's the first pattern match. So if you've got French music or the smell of fresh bread or all this stuff, then that pattern is highly influential. If it's something that's immediate or recent, that's highly influential. So the first pattern match we get is what returns us. And that's why we get in these algorithmic loops of habit of just keeping on doing the things that we do, even though if we looked at it objectively, we'd say it wasn't the best solution to that problem. And that's how Deliveroo and Uber function, because they tap into, in the moment, those weaknesses, those judgment weaknesses, and then they replicate that again and again, so that they're the first pattern match next time as well, and the time after that, and the time after that. And that's what's really powerful in marketing, is being able to latch onto that. And make use of those kind of what drives a habit, the cycle of cue, action, reward, cue, action, reward. So that the link between the cue and the action, the cue and the reward and the action becomes so strong that as soon as you think, oh, it's 11 o'clock, Diet Coke, there's kind of
okay.
This again is old advertising. It was kind of the Diet Coke break, the conscious attempt to associate Diet Coke with a trigger. Same thing with have a break, have a Kit Kat, or thank Crunchy it's Friday, or Wine Wednesday, which is a more general sort of British thing again. Like actually, if you can build around the notion of fish and chips on a Friday is a very British thing as well. Like these triggers, these natural associations, cues and associations between moments of time and occasions. Again, things like a lot of alcohol brands do this very effectively. They try and build they use advertising which involves groups of people walking into the pub, because actually that's a resonant moment. That's a trigger to think of their brand, because they've created that experience of the first pattern match. You walk in and you see the big sign and you choose that particular cider or beer or whatever. And so actually owning those kind of territories is really important for brands.
We talked about so much there. My mind is blown. I mean, I think like the point, I mean, you said it right at the beginning that, if you think of the brain as not an information processing machine, but a comparison machine, then these frameworks that sort of build on the idea of, like, I guess, opportunity cost of scarce resources, and which one is being highlighted and which trade-offs are being made. And also with sort of effective branding and marketing, it's about, getting people to remember an experience or think of a reference point, and knowing which reference point you are potentially triggering can be extremely powerful. So, I mean, it all sounds like such a cohesive structure to think about marketing from this behavior change perspective, and all of these frameworks feel so natural within this environment. But right at the beginning, you said, the work that you do at, the behaviors agency, you're one of the only people in this space who are actually using behavioral science in that way. I mean, do you think that that's going to change soon, or what's going to happen?
Yeah, well, that depends how much people copy my ideas. I
see, plagiarism.
No, I mean, I think there are plenty of examples of people doing stuff like, there's loads of people using behavioral science very effectively, not necessarily using our framework to do it, but you'll have seen the travel industry have been historically really good at using those immediacy triggers and those social proof triggers of 7 people are looking at this room now and stuff.
So stressful.
So people do that very effectively already. People are using these techniques. They're just maybe not. They're not what they're not necessarily doing. Retailers are really guilty of this. Is they sort of reach into the pricing and promotions toolkit and pull out a 3 for 2, and so they start selling 3 for 2 things on 3 for 2. But actually, there's a very big difference between if you're selling cupcakes, and toilet rolls. People want if you express the same deal differently, so it feels like you're getting more for your money on one side, or if you get more cake for the same price, people are happy. People want more cake, but they want to spend less on getting the number of toilet rolls they want. So the sort of hedonistic side of the brain just wants more of what's good, and the functional part of the brain wants to expend less on getting what's needed. And actually, that thought process doesn't always take place. Thinking about what drives people to be motivated by a particular deal, you can apply a bit more behavioural science to that than is currently done. So as I said at the beginning, people have been using these tools one way or another. Designers naturally get this. They understand cognitive ease, and they understand salience, and they understand the notion of brand assets as being things that help consumers instantly get what's being communicated to them, form the pattern really easily. They absolutely intuitively get that, but it's never been explained to them why it works.
Right.
It's natural to them, but actually, for our design and artwork team, they're really bought into this now, because actually we've talked to them about what it means to be behaviourally led, and what the impact of it is, and what if they change or take away an element, and how they can combine the copy elements into that in a way that feels like it's making use of the cognitive ease of the copy, or the chunking, or all of these sort of different elements of how the brain can process what's being thrown at it more easily, so that only the message that's changed comes through. The most effective brand campaigns are the ones that only change what needs to change. They used to say Audi, 70% of the brief was written by the brand before anything else got on the paper, because you could instantly tell an Audi ad just from the whole style of it.
Yeah.
And actually, you only need to know what the model is that you're looking at. That's the only thing it needs to communicate. And in a similar sort of way, the most effective kind of formats and templates for brands are those that you don't even process it, because you just see it. Like Coke, for instance. Obviously Coke is a trite example, but you don't need to process a Coke ad when you see it on the street. You see a 6-sheet with, that's what they call those bus shelter posters. You see a Coke ad, it's a Coke ad from 300 meters away. You'll see the little swirl on it. You'll see the red. McDonald's aren't putting those bus shelter posters up to change your mind about McDonald's. They're putting them there to make everything that you know about McDonald's come to mind. They're just triggering the little bit of I'm
already
salivation
salivating.
that happens when that they're not there to change minds or build brand. They're just there to add another little layer onto the brand, another little reminder to you that they're out there selling you, things that you want because they're salty and sugary.
It's very Pavlov's.
That's very powerful.
Yeah, very Pavlov's dog.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But that's what our brains are built to do. We take in an enormous amount of stimulus. Like, we're only actually actively processing about a max of 5% of what's coming at us at any given time. The rest of it stays the same, and our brains don't feel the need to whatever is on the other side of what you're beyond your screen right now. You're not reprocessing any of that. That's staying the same. So the brain isn't looking for it. It's only looking for change. It's scanning the horizon for threat or opportunity, and by doing that, if it spots that threat, then obviously it's the fight or flight kind of mentality kicks in. If it spots that opportunity, you can go towards it. And so what our brains are built to do is pick those threats and opportunities out of all of this sea of sameness, and decide whether to go towards it or go away from it. And we make those judgments really quickly, because obviously it used to be you make a judgment about whether that's a leopard pretty quickly. If you take time over it, it's more likely to cost you. Whereas if you make the wrong judgment quickly, you get away and you don't get to rejudge. You don't have to worry about whether you're right or not. And that's why we make bad judgments quickly, rather than making long drawn out judgments and kick in with the system 2 brain all the time. The system 1 brain just makes a quick judgment and gets out of there.
We hope.
But you can counter that. You can fight that. You can buy into. You can absolutely take that on with your. You can consciously kick that brain in and decide what you're being asked to do when you're faced with the choice of getting food delivered or whatever. You can actively fight the impulse, but it is an impulse,
and it's
and
effort.
it's driven by repetitive experience. Yeah, you've got to. It's an effort. It's a cognitive effort. You're forcing your brain to override the autopilot. Same way as people who have to give up smoking, or have to give up drinking. There's so many cues to do it in their lives that they have to actively fight against it every time. It's a physical drain on the brain to do it.
Well, I mean, so much stuff we've talked about this episode. I mean, if and I'm sure that we could talk for hours and hours about this, and I could just listen and absorb. But I mean, if there's one thing maybe you would like to leave the listener with, that may be a tough question, but is there something you'd like to leave us with, something to stir around in our brains a little bit?
I think the thing that I think is most important about understanding, like what's been missing from behavioural science, is just that key of understanding that what it is it's the science of value relativity, that it's the science of comparison. That's the thing that I would leave with you. Is basically what we do all the time is we compare one thing against another. We always need something to compare against. And if you take control of that comparison process, then you've got a good chance of winning. And actually, those comparisons can be on money, effort, time, risk. It could be on security, control, belonging. It could be on any of those levels. But actually, it's always a comparison because we are a comparison engine. And so comparing and contrasting is what drives our decision-making process, which means it's what's driving our behavior.
All right. That seems pretty bang on. I think that's a good tagline for the episode. So, Steve, very last question. If the listener, and I'm sure the listener of this episode will be very keen, where can they find you online? Where can they follow you? And is there anything you'd like to plug or to make sure that the listener checks out?
They can find me at steve@thebehaviorsagency.com. They can write to me, or they could go to our website, which is thebehaviorsagency.com. They can find me on LinkedIn. I'm not on Facebook because I've made that conscious choice.
Yeah, well done.
Very good.
And my Twitter feed is far too full of stuff that's just about like Brexit and stuff like that you and I would get on clearly well about. I mean, clearly we would understand each other on these, but not worth following from a professional standpoint. It's very much my views and my own. So I'd go for either the email or the LinkedIn to get in touch. And obviously, if anybody wants to, we're always happy to talk. And if you want us to come back again, very happy to do that because it's been really fun.
Excellent. We'll keep you to that.
And everything.
Thank you so much for making the time.
Sorry, everything will be linked down below, so we'll reduce as much friction as possible for the listener to get in contact with you, if that is their wish. And yes, just to say thank you so much, Steve, for your time and your effort and the cognitive effort spent on this podcast. We appreciate it a lot.
And the time, the risk of coming on.
All of it.
Great, really nice to talk to you.
So that was our conversation with Steve. I thought we managed to talk about so much, and I learned actually quite a bit about how to actually apply behavioral science in the marketing world. A very productive episode. What about yourself, Mela? Any key takeaways from you?
I like metric. I like models. I like a good abbreviation. I think metric works for me, but it makes sense in general. Like, it's always going to cost you something, right? It's going to cost you money, time, potentially risk. It's going to take conscious thought, conscious effort, which we know from behavioral science. Like, if you want to bet on something, don't bet on conscious effort. If you want to get something done, don't bet on that one.
I loved it as well because
I thought it was really interesting.
Super interesting. I mean, I loved it as well because it almost was exactly how an economist should think about these type of problems. It's like we're all operating under conditions of scarcity. You have scarce resources, and metric is the way of thinking about the different types of resources people have to expend, and also thinking about in terms of opportunity cost of, okay, if you spend time, then you're willing to sacrifice some money, these sort of things. It was a very neat way of looking at it. So I don't even know whether, that was how it was intended to be built, like based off these sort of economic concepts, but I definitely appreciated it for sure.
Yeah, it was good. I also, obviously, it wasn't nice of me to ask Steve about Apple because that example has actually been done to death. But I didn't realize from the perspective of the marketing perspective and the overall brand image that John Lewis was doing so well with their advertisements. Like, I do know that the general Christmas advertisement, that's always like a big thing in the UK. It is either super emotional and everyone's happy with it, or it's like quite controversial, which for an advertisement which is about Christmas, I'm always a bit like, how controversial can you get? Like, it's not like they've taken Santa and he's dancing on the roof naked, it's not that controversial at all. But I didn't realize about the other year-long advertisement. It never really promotes a specific product, which is interesting. It's definitely a nice way to go about it.
Yeah, it was.
But yeah, and of course the anti-marketing campaign.
Oh yeah,
Anti-marketing, I think, is also a very nice topic of study.
yeah. It's an interesting thought experiment. Anti-marketing. I mean, what sort of struck me about what a lot of from Steve's perspective, a lot of what successful marketing is about creating resonance and thinking about what type of emotions are people going to be feeling or reminded of feeling when they view an advert, and how that links with motivation. I thought that was super cool. I would have no idea how you'd go about measuring that if you don't have an MRI machine, but I think it just proves that you don't need an RCT or an MRI machine to do behavioral science. But yeah, it's crazy. It was really cool.
Yeah, I mean, we will eventually come close to destroying every form of Uber and its advantage through exploitation. We will get there in the end. We will. We really will. So. Anyway, I think that's it for today's episode. I think we learned a lot. I am going to dive into metric for sure. I think it's a really interesting model. As always, Steve, thank you so much for making the time and coming on the show. We really, really enjoyed it. And yes, we will take you up on the offer to have you back. Definitely will take you up on that. Guys, dear listeners, as always, everything that was mentioned in this episode is linked down below, so there's no friction in finding that. It will cost you very little time or conscious thought, and it will cost you no money. So, we're doing really good with regards to metric. And as always, we hope you have a great week, and we hope to see you again next week. Bye.
You're the dummy that don't believe in science. All your projects always be denying. You're the one I love, you're the one I wanna give to.